Welcome to week 9 of HOS 121. This week we'll look at psychosocial development in adolescence, and this first lecture looks at identity formation in adolescence. This lecture looks first at Erikson's stage of psychosocial development for adolescents, which is a stage of identity versus role confusion, and then looks at James Marcia, who added to Erikson's theory by proposing that there are 4 different identity statuses that adolescents may experience as they form their identity. And then we'll talk about forming an ethnic identity and look at self-esteem during adolescence. And this lecture includes material both from week 9 of the HOS 121 reader as well as the week 5, the self and identity week. So first let's begin by defining what is adolescence. So adolescence is a transition period from middle childhood to what's considered to be the age of majority, which would be legal adulthood. And so the period of adolescence begins in puberty, so the onset of puberty around age 12, and is considered to end around the age of 18, when people become adults, technically. But there's also now this idea of emerging adulthood, which I'll also talk about next week or in the next session on young adulthood, which sort of is a period of time that overlaps the end of adolescence and the beginning of young adulthood, when young people are still not fully adults. So you're not fully an adult necessarily at the end of adolescence, but you're moving through the period of puberty and becoming physically mature and reaching the age of majority. Adolescence and emerging adulthood is a time when a young person is becoming an adult and making a lot of choices that will shape their adult life. And so they're thinking about things like, who am I? What should I be? What do I want to study? What kind of career do I want? What kind of lifestyle do I want to choose? Do I want to have a family? So this may sound familiar to you because many of you are in this stage of emerging adulthood, which really goes in our society, people and scholars consider it to go up to age 25 for many people, where a youth is not yet a fully fledged independent adult. So for Erikson's stage, a young person who's able to choose a comfortable identity and become clear around this question of who am I and make choices has achieved the strength of fidelity. So a person demonstrating the strength of fidelity is clear about who they are and what they want. But the other side of it is role confusion. So this is when an individual has not yet developed a clear, enduring sense of their identity. And this is where a person may have difficulty around committing to values or to people or to occupational choices. Before going into different types of identities and talking about James Marcia, I wanted just to remind you about identity, and that identity comes in different forms. So this, you may remember this slide from week 5 and lecture 5.1. So identity is really, again, answers that question, who am I? So who you are and where you're going and where you fit into society. And there's different aspects of identity. There's gender identity, national identity, vocational identity, meaning what profession or occupation you're going to have, racial, ethnic identity, sexual orientation identity, spiritual and religious identity, and personal identity, which can relate to things like values that a person has. And so a person can have lots of different kinds of identities, and the identity statuses that I'll talk about, an individual might be in different places with different aspects of their identity. So that's something to keep in mind for the next several slides as we talk about status and identity development. So James Marcia is a scholar who built on the work of Erikson by using interviews and surveys of male college students to explore this issue of identity. And he proposed that there actually are 4 identity statuses, and they have to do with whether someone has experienced a crisis of really thinking about their identity. So depending on whether someone has experienced a crisis and whether they have gone through exploration of identity and made a commitment to an identity, that will put them in different places in terms of different identity statuses. So for those who have done no exploration in terms of who they are and have not made a commitment, Marcia called those people in the identity diffusion status. And I'll go into more detail about that. The folks who have done some exploration but haven't yet decided who they are in the moratorium phase. So that's an active exploration phase with no commitment. Now, some people have made a commitment, but they haven't explored, and those would be people in the identity foreclosure status, where they've formed an identity, but they've gone there too soon by sort of skipping over exploration. And those people who have experienced some crisis, they've gone through exploration and have made a commitment to an identity, are described as being in the status of identity achievement. So now I'll go into some more detail about each of those 4 different statuses. So the first status is the identity diffusion status, and this equates to Erikson's role confusion, because there's not yet a clear identity, and there isn't even exploration yet, active exploration of identity. So low commitment to identity, low exploration at this stage. And so this is an example. Jason is a high school student graduating the following semester. He has not yet thought about what he wants to do after graduation and has not yet explored uni options or job prospects. So this is a young man who hasn't gone through the crisis of identity yet, and he hasn't yet been forced to adopt or compelled to think about who he is and to adopt a particular identity. So there's in this identity status, there's low commitment to identity and there's low exploration. Another status identified by Marcia is identity foreclosure. Foreclosure involves committing to an identity prematurely without exploration or choice. And this often occurs when a parent is handing down their traditions and their commitments to a young person, and the young person just fills the role that is expected of them without making a conscious choice. And the potential for negative consequence is that the young person may later feel resentment about not being allowed to choose for him or herself how they want to spend their life. And so at this status, the individual is highly committed to an identity without having done any exploration. So this is an example. Jennifer is passionate about music. Her parents, who are successful doctors, expect her to follow in their footsteps. She enters a pre-med uni program and abandons her musical interests. So in this example, Jennifer doesn't explore the option of pursuing a career in music, and she doesn't even really explore the options of a career in medicine either. She just follows her parents' expectations without considering whether the field of medicine is actually suitable for her. So again, this would be somebody who made a choice without going through a period of exploration in terms of identity. The identity moratorium status is where a young person is actively exploring an identity but hasn't yet made a commitment to a particular identity. So this can be an exciting and interesting stage for an adolescent because they're trying on different things as they're thinking about their identity. And during this stage, there may be some conflict with parents and authority figures, particularly if there's an identity that a young person is adopting that goes against what the family expects in terms of religion, for example, or this example. So this is an example for a young person who's considering her sexual orientation. So Samantha is unsure about her sexual orientation. She's dated boys and girls and isn't sure if she considers herself straight, bisexual, or gay. She's joined a club at her high school for queer students. So this, is an example of someone who's thinking about and exploring what it would mean to be, different sexual orientations, and hasn't yet decided clearly which one is the best match for her. So again, this is the stage of, or the status of active exploration, but not yet having made a commitment to a particular identity. And then the fourth status is identity achievement, and this is the completion of identity in terms of at least one aspect of identity. And an individual can be in different statuses for different aspects of their identity at the same time. So, but for a particular aspect of identity, an individual may be in the status of identity achievement. And this means that the individual has explored aspects of a particular identity before adopting it. And in this achievement status, the individual has a high degree of commitment and has already pursued a high degree of exploration with regard to that identity. So this is an example. Richard reads a book about vegan diets and decides to consult a nutritionist about devising a diet plan for himself. He researched vegan diets and found the research evidence personally compelling enough to become a vegan. He has been a vegan for 3 years and is secure in his identity. So this is a person who's made a choice around lifestyle and around values and has made a commitment to a particular identity. So the reader on page 184 describes some different factors that influence identity formation and how adolescents may proceed and experience different statuses in their various aspects of their identities, and identifies these 5 factors as contributing towards identity formation. So one is the cognitive development that arrives in the adolescent years. So the adolescent brain changes quite a bit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the 3rd lecture this week. But one thing that changes is the ability for abstract thinking. And so adolescents are able to think more about their possible selves. So we've talked about this before, the idea of the real and possible self, where the adolescent now is in a place where they can imagine different identities that they might experience in the future and what that might be like, which helps them think about identity and who they want to be. Personality is another factor that contributes to identity formation with people who have personalities that are high in openness and openness to novelty and are emotionally stable and curious and responsible are more likely to do the kind of exploration that Marcia describes versus a personality that's high in a neuroticism, would be less likely to be open to exploring. Relationships with parents, again, become important. So the parenting style comes up again as an important factor in terms of development with the warm democratic style of parenting associated with authoritative parenting, again, giving children a context where they can explore and have good self-confidence to do that kind of exploration, and also the attachment relationship with parents, giving children and adolescents a secure base. So that idea of a secure base where you can go and you can explore and come back to a parent when needed. That happens in terms of identity formation too, where there's some freedom, knowing that there's still an anchor point with the parent. Whereas with parents that are more controlling, those youth would be more likely to be more stuck in foreclosure, for example, where they're choosing an identity without that period of exploration. Or diffusion, where they don't really do the exploration or commitment when there's not, again, that strong kind of emotional support. So if children are not receiving that kind of support and attention from their parents, which might be associated with the neglectful style of parenting, uninvolved, or the over-controlling with the authoritarian parenting. Having opportunities to explore is important for identity formation. So, for example, the reading talks about university as being the kind of space where people can explore and try on different options, and that really is great for the identity moratorium status, where there's active exploration, but you haven't yet committed. You can come to a place like university and you can see all the many options that you might choose, for example, to study and for career. And then cultural context also plays a role. With more traditional cultures, people generally did automatically go into what their parents would be doing, for example. So they wouldn't necessarily go through the exploration phase, and they would be more likely to go to the foreclosure status. In this cultural context, where there's more expectation of individualism, you're expected to sort of figure out what you want as an individual. And it's also true that the cultural context allows for exploration of the aspect of identity related to sexual orientation, which would be, in certain cultures, you wouldn't have the opportunity to explore that aspect of identity. So again, cultural context is another factor that's important, and all these factors are important in terms of allowing for freedom and for the personal comfort to explore informing identity. So ethnic identity is a particular type of identity. It's feeling part of one's ethnic or racial group and learning the special customs and traditions that go along with that group's culture and heritage, and may include knowing also the language that goes along with that group, if there is a special language. And the phases that have been observed in research related to forming an ethnic identity are very similar to what Marcia describes with identity formation overall. So there's a status where an adolescent may not even be thinking about their ethnic roots and may not consider them to be important. So that would relate to the identity diffusion status, where there's no exploration and there's also not a clear identity, commitment to identity. And then an adolescent may be in a place where they're exploring, where the young person is exploring his or her ethnic heritage and how that impacts themselves personally, and learning about cultural traditions and history. And that would be similar to the moratorium status, where there's active exploration going on. And then an adolescent, after a period of active exploration, may develop a distinct ethnic self-identity. So being from a particular group may become part of how they see themselves and how they define themselves. So again, that may be being an Aboriginal Australian, being from a particular group, being ethnically Italian, or being Macedonian. So it's it can be any group, but again, there's a sort of similar dynamic, as Marcia pointed out, around exploration and making a commitment, and being clear about the ethnic self-identity if there has been a period of active exploration first. So like with the Marcia statuses, this is an example of forming an ethnic identity. So Jasneet celebrates the Indian festival of Diwali with her extended family and celebrates Australian holidays with her peers from high school. So it's, when someone has embraced the cultural traditions and knows about them, but for many young people, they're often balancing an ethnic identity with being part of the mainstream society as well. And so, many people will be Indian, Australian, for example, and sort of weighing both of those identities at the same time. So the reader talks about also what influences positive ethnic or racial identity. And one factor is how parents socialize their children. So it's this is where children often learn about their cultural traditions, is through the sociocultural method of socialization, where they're learning about traditions, they learn about values, they participate in events and rituals. And then parents also have a role in terms of talking to their children about what it means to be part of a multicultural society and how to deal with prejudice. So there's quite a literature that looks at how parents socialize their children to be prepared emotionally for racism if their group is often targeted by racism. So parents have a role there in terms of preparing their children. And for Indigenous Australian youth, there's some research that looks at how teachers and peers and Indigenous role models and community members also play important roles in terms of helping a young person know what it means, to understand their Aboriginality. And then having that, achieving that ethnic identity can have a protective effect on self-concept, and is associated with higher self-esteem and lower depression, again, when children are part of groups that are often the target of racism. Having positive feelings about one's ethnic group can be protective, to not feel as deeply those impacts of racism, because there's a pride there in terms of being from a particular group. So the final point to make in this lecture is around self-esteem in adolescence. So the idea of identity answers the question, who am I? And self-concept is also about how one thinks about oneself. And then self-esteem, if you recall, it answers the question, how good am I? How do I feel about myself? And how do I feel about myself in different domains? You can have global self-esteem, but then it's also differentiated by different domains like academics and athletics and how you feel, you look physically, those different things. And so we talked about this before, that self-esteem tends to be high in early childhood, and it tends to be globally high, where across all domains, young children tend to feel pretty good about themselves. And then it tends to decline in middle childhood as children start to become held to a standard and assessed in comparison to their peers. And then it tends to stabilize in adolescence at various points, either high or low for a particular individual. And in adolescence, again, there's this dynamic around peer comparison, where young people are comparing themselves to their peers and thinking about where they're at in the pecking order. And adolescents in particular, even more so than in middle childhood, they really become clear about where they're at in terms of their self-esteem and how that is differentiated by different aspects. And even in their social self-esteem, they may feel good about their relationships with their family, but they may feel negative about how they are doing in terms of romantic relationships. So it becomes more highly differentiated. And adolescent self-worth is higher when they feel that they're skilled in domains that they value. So when they feel that they are good in things like academics, if they care about academics, when they think peers think highly of them, and when they have parents who are affectionate, involved, and set reasonable expectations and are willing to discuss rules and discipline. So again, it's the authoritative parenting tends to have the best impact in terms of self-esteem, and then the warmth in terms of parenting from permissive parenting as well. But with the authoritative parenting, there's that extra element of setting rules and talking about rules and discipline, which has a protective function in adolescence. Because adolescence, even though, as we'll talk about, it's a time of a lot of change when they start to turn more to their peers, relationships with parents still remain very important. So now we'll continue on and talk about sexual and romantic relationships in adolescence, and then talk about risky behaviors this week.